Playing Martin Luther King Jr. was an honor for me on so many levels. It was the most I've ever prepared for a role. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized bias when he saw it, knew what he was talking about. I hope that the opening of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial will be a life-altering experience that inspires every American to rededicate themselves to the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. I thank those activists such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and others. They risked, and sometimes lost, their lives in the name of freedom and equality. When white supremacy becomes institutional, it begins to harm the very people who are not simply outside of it because of their race. It begins to harm the folk who look like the folk who want to be in charge. Martin Luther King Jr. understood this, Malcolm X understood this, James Baldwin really understood this. Some people criticize the faithful for getting involved in politics, but it's important to remember that down through the centuries, people motivated by their faith have done many important things. Martin Luther King Jr., motivated by his faith, brought about an end to segregation in our country. Even after facing jail, Martin Luther King Jr. courageously and boldly spoke out against racial inequality. When I was 15 years old in 1955, I heard of Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on our radio. Martin Luther King Jr. would say love and not hate would make America great. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy led directly to the passage of a historic law, the Gun Control Act of 1968. I was raised in Arizona, and I went to public school, and the extent of my knowledge of the civil rights movement was the story of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. I wonder how much my generation knows. Early on, I wrote a letter to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I was 17. I felt called, moved. I think it's a good thing for a president or political leaders to want to put their values or their faith into action. Desmond Tutu did that in South Africa. Martin Luther King Jr. did that here. This is a good thing. It was the understanding of the power of perception that allowed the Martin Luther King Jr. generations to stay true to the strategy of nonviolence, refusing to retaliate when every emotional instinct would justify them doing so. Memphis is the place where rock was born and Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. It's full of contradictions, abject poverty, and riches that only music can provide. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of my personal heroes. If the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is to live, our babies must live. Our mothers must choose life. If we refuse to answer the cry of mercy from the unborn, and ignore the suffering of the mothers, then we are signing our own death warrants. The greatest moral leader of my lifetime was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose private life does not bear close examination. We've lost leaders from Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. and countless others who have worked to bend the arc of the universe towards justice and equality. Yet, we remain undaunted, dedicated to striving for a fairer, more equal society. The idea that America elected a black man to be its president 40 years after it declined to allow Martin Luther King Jr. to stand on a balcony without getting shot still maintains its power to awe and inspire. Barack Obama commits war crimes, Somalia, Yemen. He commits war crimes in Pakistan, Afghanistan. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to keep a spotlight on war crimes, to keep track of the innocents killed. There is a major clash. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. made me very, very sad, and I mourned and I cried like many of our citizens did. Martin Luther King Jr. really understood the role of the churches when he said, "The church is not meant to be the master of the state. We don't sort of take power and grab the levers of government and impose our agenda down people's throats. We will not allow this day of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial to go without somebody going to jail." I wasn't predicted to be anything. I just followed an inner spirit, and it put me in the right place and the right time. I didn't want to be the mayor of Atlanta. I didn't want to run for Congress. I didn't want to work for Martin Luther King Jr. I wanted to work close to him and be a writer and write about the movement. The heroes of my childhood were Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy, but I was inspired by the ideals of our 40th president and became a Republican. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was a bridge builder, not a wall builder. I remember back in the 1960s, late 50s, really, reading a comic book called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Story. 14 pages. It sold for 10 cents. And this little book inspired me to attend nonviolence workshops, to study about Gandhi, about Thoreau, to study Martin Luther King, Jr., to study civil disobedience. We forgot that Martin Luther King, Jr. changed his discourse toward the end of his life because he understood that the real fundamental problem of this country was not just race, it was class. It was the economical situation of not only poor blacks but also the poor white part of the population and everything in between. The greatest lesson I learned that year in Mrs. Henry's class was the lesson Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. tried to teach us all: never judge people by the color of their skin. God makes each of us unique in ways that go much deeper. There's a gap somehow between empathy and activism. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. spoke of soul force, something that emanates from a deep truth inside of us and empowers us to act. Once you identify your inner genius, you will be able to take action, whether it's writing a check or digging a well. One day after laying a wreath at the tomb of Martin Luther King Jr., President Bush appoints a federal judge who has built his career around dismantling Dr. King's legacy. I couldn't say no to A. Philip Randolph and no to Martin Luther King, Jr. These two men, I loved them, I admired them, and they were my heroes. Opponents of legal birth control, including abortion, have tried for decades to play the race card, saying that legal abortion is racist. What they ignore is that Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. accepted the Margaret Sanger Award from Planned Parenthood in 1966. I think, along with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks will go down as one of the two most well-known and remembered figures out of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a man of peace. He was a radical pacifist, and so he was against war across the board. I am really enjoying the new Martin Luther King Jr. stamp. Just think about all those white bigots, licking the backside of a black man. One of my first memories is marching with my mom. I was in kindergarten with the Catholic ladies when Martin Luther King Jr. got shot. We wore the black armbands and marched downtown. Great American leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. worshipped God just as our founding fathers did. We must never forget this important aspect of our heritage or use it as a political bargaining chip. My all-time heroes are Thurgood Marshall and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., two men who had to really work to achieve what they did. And I had the privilege of meeting them both. I think if people really read Martin Luther King, Jr., then they would begin to understand what he really represented. Martin Luther King, Jr. tried to live his life serving others. Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered as our Prince of Peace, of civil rights. We owe him something major that will keep his memory alive. I have very purposely never signed up with commercial lecture agencies as most, I think, prominent historical authors do because, to me, that's a contradiction of who I believe I am given my absorption of the teaching of Martin Luther King, Jr. When I was 15 years old and in the 10th grade, I heard of Martin Luther King, Jr. 3 years later. When I was 18, I met Dr. King and we became friends. 2 years after that I became very involved in the civil rights movement. I was in college at that time. As I got more and more involved, I saw politics as a means of bringing about change. Martin Luther King, Jr. would have been the last person to have wanted his iconization and his heroism. He was an enormously guilt-laden man. He was drenched in a sense of shame about his being featured as the preeminent leader of African American culture and the civil rights movement. When I was teaching in the 1960s in Boston, there was a great deal of hope in the air. Martin Luther King Jr. was alive, Malcolm X was alive, great leaders were emerging from the Southern freedom movement. I think all of us thought that by the 70s, at the latest the 80s, all the world's problems would be solved and everyone would be getting along fine. And instead we saw that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated that year. Robert F. Kennedy died. We saw that it was going to be a lot more difficult than I think we had thought. I was proud to march beside some of the most notable civil rights activists, such as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Joseph L. Rao, Jr., from Selma to Montgomery. President Obama's achievements and failures must be evaluated by comparison to those chief executives who have come before him and not be measured against the prophetically moral voice of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. could have argued that separate water fountains were too expensive, a waste of money. He would have been right about that. But cost was beside the point. Martin Luther King, Jr. Day is a time to honor the greatest champion of racial equality who taught a nation, through compassion and courage, about democracy, nonviolence and racial justice. Martin Luther King, Jr. didn't carry just a piece of cloth to symbolize his belief in racial equality, he carried the American flag. Thank God we have the example of Martin Luther King, Jr. People need role models. They need to see examples of people in people's lives, and that's why it's so important not just to commemorate his life, but to study and try to live by the principles of that life. I remember the day Richard Nixon won in 1968. That was a time that seemed certain to bring about long-awaited seismic change in America. But events of tragic proportion took us on a turn. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. were suddenly dead. Sitting in the Oval Office, beneath a painting of George Washington, with a bust of Martin Luther King Jr. over his right shoulder and a bust of Abraham Lincoln over his left shoulder, Obama told National Journal that the country's economic woes are deep and endemic. You cannot hear the name Martin Luther King, Jr., and not think of death. You might hear the words, "I have a dream," but they will doubtlessly only serve to underscore an image of a simple motel balcony, a large man made small, a pool of blood. For as famous as he may have been in life, it is, and was, death that ultimately defined him. One of the greatest men to ever walk this land was Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. His life exemplified unity by bringing people together for the good of all. In any small way I hope to someday bring people together like Dr. King. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Southern, conservative minister who believed in the American promise. His dream was patriotic and traditional. Family, work, self-determination and religion comprised his core values. In 1968, the sanitation workers of Memphis tried to form a union. The city resisted. The Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. came to support them. That was where he lost his life.